This is only the second time that I've presented this, so if you guys can't hear me well or something, let me know and I'll speak up a little bit louder. I'm going to be talking, can y'all hear me through this okay?
It's a little low.
I'm going to be talking about some plant communities of Louisiana. There's many more that I won't be able to touch on today, but we're going to focus on some of the major ones, especially in the southeast. So to start, we're going to talk about ecoregions, and this is a map. I think it's provided by Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries. And you can see they've divided it into 6 major categories. Those are the ones that are colored. And it kind of creates this tapestry of different ecoregions that interact with each other. Some of them are almost identical to each other, but in different physical places because of the way the geography is formed over the millennia. So the 6 major ecoregions are formed based off of their geology, topography, physiology, the actual plants that you'll find there, the climate, the soils, the different wildlife that inhabit those areas, and also the hydrology. That's what's going to inform us on each of these ecoregions. The 6 major ones include the Western Gulf coastal plains, the South Central Plains, Southeastern Plains, the Mississippi Alluvial Plain, the Mississippi Valley Loess Plains, and the Southern Coastal Plains.
Which one is the third?
So we have a couple, let me go back. Depending on where you're at in St. Tammany, over here you're going to be in the Southern Coastal Plain, and then up here it's more of a, this is going to be more pine savanna, or what would have been pine savanna if it wasn't developed. But we're kind of split. We also have some swamp that carves in across like the Bogachido and the Pearl River there. So we're kind of in a mix, which makes our area really unique and actually one of the most biodiverse in the state as far as plant life goes. So let's start with soils, because that's kind of where everything comes from. It can be categorized into 3 major components, the largest being sand, medium particle would be silt, and then the smallest is clay. And they kind of interact with each other to form different types of soils with different ratios of each. So there's a total of 12 different soil textures that we have that we can kind of identify. And they identify these often using colored paint chips, which I'll show you in the next slide. The scientists can kind of do a color match to help determine which type of soil they might be looking at. But they're also using context, where they're at. And there's different, I'm not a soil scientist, so I don't really know exactly what like chroma and color saturation values and stuff are, but we'll kind of just quickly breeze by it because it's worth mentioning. But the soil color is often tied to a number of soil properties such as organic matter, which can make it really dark, or iron oxides, which can make it that reddish clay that we see. And then the loess is often characterized as being like a pale yellow. So many areas of Louisiana will feature alluvium or loess in their names, and the alluvium is a soil type that's come from the outwash of rivers and actual, when you're going way back, glacial melt, and then the loess is basically windblown, and this is also through that Holocene period where glaciers were melting and we ended up with the continents that we see today. So given the large number of rivers that we have across Louisiana and the amount of rainfall that we get, it's no wonder that so many of our soils are alluvial. And additionally, I just mentioned that, we get a lot of rainfall, so it contributes to the low pH of our soils, making them acidic. And sometimes that's not considered a benefit for plants, so plants have had to adapt to those types of soils that are not as nutrient rich. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is kind of a tool to help visualize the different types of soils that we have. Loam is going to be kind of like a finer dirt, and then you have the sandy loam that's going to come from like riverbanks and stuff. You get the clay that's on maybe the banks of rivers where it's formed like a bluff, and you have all different kinds of mixes of these. This is one of those color cards, a Munsell color chart for soil that scientists can use to quickly field identify what kind of soil they might be standing on. Things that are influencing the soil composition, we've briefly talked about alluvium. And like I said earlier, they've been formed from sediment deposited by rivers, which is often rich in organic matter because it's been broken down and pounded against gravel and things like that. Loess is completely windblown, and it's a significant component of some soil types, particularly in the bluff hills and the hills of the state. If you look at the alluvial valley on the map, you'll see two different loess deposits on each side because it was blown over the glaciers. So that's what's contributed to kind of a more hillier landscape. The clay soils are more heavy, they can be pretty fertile, and that's also part of the Mississippi River alluvium soil deposits, and they're highly fertile, but they can crack when they're dry and swell when they're wet. Silty soils are formed from the windblown loess and are rich in silt and contain a significant amount of clay and fine sand. You have mucky peat soils. Those are high in decomposed organic matter and are found in more like the marshy areas. They're not very oxygen rich. They're not very porous. And then the same goes for the marsh soils. They can be saltwater or freshwater in those marshes, which can affect the different kind of plant life that you'll see there. And other contributing factors are the rainfall. Those can cause those nutrients to be leached out of the soil, and it's impacting the fertility of it. And then we have organic material, so high levels of organic material. You're going to see that in marshes and stuff. It just keeps dying on top of itself and builds up because we're not tilling it or developing on much of that. This is just another map showing the different kind of soils or the regions that arise from those soils. And so like I said earlier, you can see kind of where the alluvial Mississippi River Valley flows down, and on each side you'll see kind of a comparable type of soil, but those plants have remained separated and can be slightly different genetically. So it's important if you're going to be using native plants in a landscape, you want to try to match your type of ecoregion, the local ecotype. So a couple concepts here to talk about before we get into the habitats are plant succession. So when you have a recently disturbed site, say a developer's come in and clear cut something and then they leave it alone, you're going to see an initial suite of plants that are going to take root. Those are going to be adapted to, they kind of like disturbed soils. They're not going to stay there forever necessarily, but they're going to be the first ones to take advantage of that disruption. And so naturally it's occurred from volcanic eruptions or glacial retreat. We're not seeing that as often down here these days, but pioneer species like lichens and mosses are the first to colonate. These pioneers will break down rock and soil and add organic matter, allowing for other types of grasses and shrubs to eventually take root. And then eventually you'll get a secondary succession, which is a more common type of disturbance that we'll see, such as a fire, a hurricane, or logging. And you'll see a lot of like goldenrod popping up in these areas, a lot of grasses, and then as it develops, larger plants and shrubs will take hold, and a lot of times you'll see a lot of invasives take hold in these areas that are developed and left alone, or clear cut and left alone for a while. You'll see a lot of like Chinese tallow and things like that start to move in, which can be a problem. But eventually it'll mature into a forest community. And so a little bit more on succession. We have early succession characterized by fast-growing, shade-intolerant plants like grasses and shrubs, and those will colonate those open areas. Mid-succession, as the canopy develops, larger plants and shrubs will begin to dominate, and the early colonizers are shaded out. So it's kind of a phase in, phase out. The late succession and the climax communities where it's stable, it doesn't really change much beyond that. If left alone or not disturbed, and that's kind of what we used to have in the southeast here. We used to have a lot of longleaf pine savanna And now there's very little remnants of that left because it was so heavily logged up until about the 30s. And because those sites were left alone for so long, these trees were hundreds of years old. I think longleaf pines can live to about 500 years old, which is the oldest that have been recorded, I think, in North Carolina. And you'll see so much more plant diversity, a lot more rare plants than we'll find today, just because it's had the time to develop in that spot in situ. The factors influencing plant succession, we've talked about these. The fires, storms, human activities. A lot of Native Americans would actually set controlled burns, prescribed burns to help improve hunting. And so between lightning strikes and hunting, burning has been a part of our landscape for a long time. Another factor is the soil, which we've also talked about, but that's needed for the plants to grow substrate, and a lot of these plants can grow and bust up rock and use that as the mineral content, but once those are broken down and those plants die, it helps build the soil. And then climate. All these things influence what kind of plant succession you'll see. Plant succession is crucial for the health and resilience of ecosystems as it promotes biodiversity and creates a stable environment. It's always working towards a more stable environment. And we can help do that by understanding this concept to help kind of restore and manage some of our natural lands. Another concept that's important to hit on is facultative versus obligate species. And so an obligate species is like a plant that needs a certain set of requirements in order to exist. So you're only going to find these plants within an environment that has all these requirements. However, they might be alongside another plant that's found in many different types of habitats and ecosystems, and that just means it's more or less facultative. So it's a term that's used to describe plants, whether or not they can be found in one environment or across multiple environments, and how likely it is that they'll be found outside of certain environments or not. So a lot of the plants that we see here have adapted towards fire and need fire to exist, and the pine lily is a good example of that. It's a pretty rare plant. I've found one in the Abita Flatwoods. There's another member that Wild Ones has been able to tour their property that had a bunch of them blooming this year, but there used to be.
We'll be doing that again this year. But so for members, we're going to have regular nature walks to this really special property.
Yeah, I'm sad I missed out on it, but I was happy I at least got to see one. It's the first time I've ever seen one. It was this year in the wild, and their numbers, they're not so common anymore because of the fire suppression that we've seen since like the 40s or 50s. The Smokey the Bear campaign was trying to prevent communities from burning down, but we took fire out of the woods, and now the woods are very thick with shrubs, and not as much sunlight is getting down. And a lot of these plants require fire to germinate. And so I think the pine lily is one of these where if it's not being burnt frequently, it just won't be found in that spot. Another concept is ecotones. So you'll see, obligate species, and then you might see some more facultative species, and you'll see a blend between ecosystems often. And the Abita Flatwoods is actually a good example of that. There's a little bit of bottomland, hardwood areas. There's a lot of unique ecosystems within the Abita Flatwoods, but there's bog, there's pine savanna, and you'll kind of see them blend together in certain areas. So this is more about the obligate and facultative. This is a little bit heavy on numbers, but it's a good concept to be exposed to so it can help you understand why you might see saw palmetto in so many places, but not the pine lily. It's just different requirements for the plant. Some plants are needy. And then another important concept before we jump into the habitats is native versus naturalized versus invasive. Native plants are plants that are occurring in a place in which they have evolved without any kind of interference. You can have native plants that are endemic, which means So, for example, we have irises throughout the state of Louisiana, and I think in Abbeville they have a red iris, and that's probably one of the most rare plants we have in the state because it only occurs in Abbeville naturally. And that means it's endemic to that area. If you take it out of that area, that's interference. And that's not a huge problem because they're all native plants, but it's a very interesting thing when you find something that's evolved in one very specific place for so long. You have other native plants that can be more aggressive. Inkberry, I believe, is a native, and you find it in pine savannas, and it tends to kind of dominate the areas that it's found in and doesn't allow much else to grow around it. Now you have introduced species, which are non-natives. Some of them are invasive, which means they are very aggressive and dominate and crowd out other natives, which can be a problem for the wildlife and things like that. But you have others that are not so damaging to an ecosystem. They might just occur on like the edge or a disturbed site and not really spread so aggressively. And if they're useful to things like pollinators, like mimosa trees, I don't see them ever really dominating a landscape. You usually see them on the side of highways. Butterflies and bees seem to like them a lot. I don't have a huge issue with them. I think there's more important invasives to worry about, like Kogon grass, which is in that bottom right corner, and Chinese tallow tree, which is right above that. We also see a lot down here of this Japanese climbing fern, and that can just completely choke out other plants. To be able to identify plants, this is just going to be a really quick run over of some botany ideas where you have, if you want to look at what type of plant something is, you can key it out. And the way to do that is looking at its margin of the leaf. You have different types of margins. Some of them are undulated with like lobes, like on an oak tree or on an oak leaf. And then others like river birch, for example, might have more of a dentate margin. But it's just a way of keying out plants. You look at the margins, you look at the leaf shape, and you can also look at the vein structure within that plant. And those are all going to kind of inform you of what kind of species that might be. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but fire in our particular, in St. Tammany Parish and a lot of other parts of the state, has been crucial to maintaining these natural areas. We get the most concentration of lightning strikes for the country, I think only right behind Hawaii, or we might be tied with them a lot of years, which means historically we would have seen a lot of these burns happening across the landscape. And when they happen so frequently, it doesn't really allow things to get so brushy. So those they're called fuel ladders. When we don't burn, you get that brush. It can carry the fire up to the tree canopy, and it can take down a whole forest. However, with regular burning, you see it kind of maintaining this open understory, which allows dappled sunlight down, and that increases the biodiversity of the ground level. So you have a lot of different grasses and flowering plants like forbs and small shrubs instead of just like a thick woods that you can't walk through. And this is really great for wildlife. Turkey love it, quail love it, deer love it. And if you're a hunter, that's probably something you would love too, to be able to walk through and see the game walking through the piney woods. So nowadays, we intentionally do prescribe burning to try to recreate this in a more controlled manner. And then we can kind of document when we're doing it and have a regular schedule to maintain a landscape. So getting into some of the plant communities that we have here, we're going to start from like the out on the Gulf and coming in. We do have barrier islands, and those are really crucial for bird migration because it's one of their first stops when they're coming from South America to the southeast, because we're right in the middle of the Mississippi Flyway. And beyond those barrier islands, though, we'll see the marshes. These marshes can be freshwater or saltwater, and that will kind of determine what kind of plants you'll see there. If you go down to Big Branch, you'll see a lot of marsh. You can walk right over it on the boardwalks, and you'll see different types of like wiregrass, different kinds of canes maybe. You'll see pickerel weed, you'll see arrowroot, There's a lot of wading birds to hide and eat crawfish. And even the early humans in the freshwater marshes, there's a lot of food source there. They're putting out a lot of rice, wild rices, and a lot of edible rooted plants. You'll also see like wax myrtles and stuff trying to kind of in these areas. And then as you move upland, you might find yourself in a swamp. And swamps are going to be heavy on cypress and tupelo, that's bald cypress. There's also pond cypress that you see more inland on land. Both can exist though in this habitat. And a lot of Spanish moss. You'll see iris. You'll see gum trees. But it's a very specific habitat that's going to support a different type of wildlife. Moving on beyond that, if we're going a little bit more upland, you'll find yourself in a bottomland hardwood forest. And you'll still see some iris and stuff, but then you'll see some more like saw palmetto. These are areas that are capable of flooding, but then often that flooding recedes just as quickly as it came, and you'll be left with a walkable forest. It might be kind of muddy. You'll still see some cypress maybe in here, but you're going to end up seeing more like hickory trees, maybe some oak trees, maple trees, a little bit more diversity in the grasses. They're able to kind of hold root there. And when you go up from that, this picture is taken at Big Branch. You can kind of see the transition of like marsh into savanna. Where those dead pine trees are, it's been more flooded, so the pine trees can't really stand in water. Eventually you might see cypress growing out of there, but the grasses are pretty dominant, so you have this kind of mix between a marsh and the pine savanna, as you see in the distance there. Pine savannas are super biodiverse. They're gonna be like the choice spot for pollinators to procreate and feed. And with those insects, you're going to see a lot of birds. The red-cockaded woodpecker is an endangered bird that you'll find at Big Branch. They use the hardwood of the longleaf pine specifically the older longleaf pines, because they have this fungus that's in the center of the trunk when they get older, and it's a spongy, soft fungus where they can drill into that and make a cavity for their nest. And when they drill into these longleaf pines, they're so sap heavy, the sap will drool out over the side of the bark, and it prevents snakes from being able to climb up and steal the eggs and other animals from climbing up. So it's a very crucial habitat for the red-cockaded woodpecker, which is endangered, and I think that's mainly why this park was created, was to protect the family of red-cockaded woodpeckers there. And within these longleaf pine savannas, you have higher and lower spots. So I guess it's no longer a savanna at some point when you get to an upland. It's kind of an evening photo, so you can't see it, but it gets more brushy as you get, some more undulating land with elevation, some more clay, heavy soils. There's still a lot of biodiversity there, but then as you go into the low spots, you'll see where it's holding water, you'll have more of like a bog. The bog is going to host a suite of plants that are going to be adapted to nutrient-poor soils, and so a lot of these plants are carnivorous. You'll see sundews. Sundews will, they're a very small plant found on the floor, on the woods, and they produce like a sticky substance on their little like tentacles. I'm not using accurate terminology, but insects will be attracted to the scent of that, and it's like a sweet nectar. They'll fly onto it, and that plant will wrap itself around it and trap the insect. And as well as these pitcher plants, these pale pitcher plants will be in very wet areas, and they do a similar thing where it's like a long tube, and the tube produces a sweet nectar along the rim of it. A fly or something will fly onto that rim, and it smells good, it tastes good, but once they land on it, it's very slippery. So they end up falling into the tube, and the plant will digest it in the enzymes at the base of that pitcher. A really cool plant is also the white-top sedge. They kind of look like little shooting stars coming up out of the landscape. There's some other plants in there, but it's a beautiful sight to me to be able to see that matrix of plant communities that's only seen in these kind of boggy areas. Out west, you'll have more of a Cajun prairie. The reason there's no trees on the Cajun prairie is because there's a clay pan underneath the soil there, so it doesn't really allow taproots to penetrate. And so what you end up with is these prairies that are very diverse. These are also historically burnt, which increases the biodiversity and increases the seed production, and this takes years. So if there was a vast majority of the West was Cajun prairie before people came and settled there and developed it and farmed it, and now you have maybe like 2% left of these intact, true Cajun prairies. And so there's people out there that are trying to restore farmland into Cajun prairie because the soils from those farms are going to be depleted at some point and we won't be able to produce as much food from them. This is why the soil is so good. These plants put down such deep roots, and those roots, after the tops of the plants die off and are burnt, it contributes to the biomass of the soil. Those roots can also die a little bit and regrow in different directions, and it creates a really rich soil. And after we've gotten rid of this and farmed it for so long, the soil will get depleted. So I think the next phase of agriculture for the U.S. will be into restoration, and so we can rotate agriculture. But they're also just highly important for the native wildlife. You're not going to have our 800-something species of moths or 200-something species of native bees without this biodiversity, because a lot of these plants are host plants for individual species where they need that specific plant to lay their egg, and those caterpillars will eat that specific plant so they can get to maturity. So they're really vital habitats. These are all native orchids of Louisiana. Some of them are a lot more uncommon, but something you guys might have seen, these are pretty common. You can see these in people's mowed yards sometimes. They pop up. They're called, it's called Spiranthes, and it's got this beautiful spiral look. But these are all very unique plants that we're not going to see as much of if we don't help promote them like Wild Ones is doing, to help do like seed collections and plant rescues and things like that. This green orchid was found out in a swamp near Bush and Pearl River kind of area. It's an epiphyte, which means it'll attach to a tree. You have other orchids that grow out of the ground. They're really cool species there. The top left is that sundew I was telling you about. It's got these little tiny follicles with the sap on them, the nectar, and that's what attracts the insects, and it'll move around that insect once it lands on it. These are all the carnivorous species of Louisiana. We have, I think, 7 of them, and some of them are, like they live in the water, but all of them are carnivorous because they've adapted to poorer nutrient soils. Lots of different forbs that we have specific to Louisiana. In the Cajun prairie, you see a lot of the liatris spikes. They can get really tall out west. Here we have different species that are very similar. They look almost the same, but they stay a lot shorter, and it's just that different ecotype, like a subspecies of the genus. And we are probably familiar with the goldenrod that you see on the bottom left, the native iris to the right of that, false foxglove. That's monarda, or like a bee balm. There's a spotted bee balm that's pictured there that me and Alex found in Lacombe. And Stokes aster on the bottom right. It's painted. I always get the painted bunting and this flower confused. What's Indian blanket? Yeah, I don't know why. I would call it painted blanket by accident a lot, but you'll see that a lot in like Grand Isle. It likes kind of being in those sandy soils down there. I've seen a lot of it. And you have some swamp sunflower. The blue curls, that's up in Money Hill area. That's a really cool plant. It was a new species of blue curls identified in Florida just last year. So we don't even really know the whole scope of all the native plants that are potentially out there when they're rare. And this is a type of hibiscus, that red flower. It's a scarlet rose hibiscus, I believe. And then my favorite native plant, it's a vine. It's a really small passion flower. It's called the yellow passion flower, or Passiflora lutea. And I don't see it terribly often, but I see it. I'm lucky enough to find it a couple times throughout the year in different spots. But it's just a really unique plant. Oh, and I didn't mention, but that plant has a lot of these plants do, but the Passiflora lutea was discovered to have a singular native bee that uses only pollen from that plant to feed its young. But it's been so unstudied that they don't know much about it, or like how endangered it might be, or what. This is just showing the different kind of tree diversity that we have. There's a redbud on the bottom right, a red swamp maple in the middle there, parsley hawthorn on the top right. Those you can find at North Lake Nature Center here around the park. Willow, black willow trees. The buttonbush is a pollinator favorite, and they put out these like golf ball sized blooms in the spring. And obviously our live oak, and the live oaks are one of the most supportive tree species for wildlife. I think Doug Tallamy says there's like 500 species that benefit from the live oak, whether it's for food or habitat or yeah. And then that's a longleaf pine in the bottle, what's it called? Bottle cleaner stage. I forget what it's called. So you can learn about all these plants through the library for free. You can go and find these field guides and skim through them, or just see what you find out when you're walking around and compare it to the books. But these are just some examples of trees, or of books that are focused on the Southeast. So, thank y'all.